So on the screen here, we have Dr. Seema Yasmin, who will start by introducing herself. So building on the bio that you have in front of you. And then we're going to be talking a little bit more about these terms, disinformation and misinformation, but leaving plenty of time for us to ask questions that maybe weren't answered in our last session as well. So Dr. Yasmin, you're in the room now. You can see most folks. We have about maybe 12, 15 of us in the room, a mix of educators, students. When we come to ask questions, we'll be sure to come forward and introduce ourselves. But we'd love to start with an introduction from you. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, some of your professional background, how you decided to become a journalist, also where you're based today? We're all in Chicago. We'd love to, center ourselves. Where are you today? And tell us a little bit more about you, and that might help us center our conversation to start. Over to you.
Sounds good. Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing very well and have been enjoying the day so far. I have taken over some random person's office. I don't know whose office it is, but I am in the Simon & Schuster building, the headquarters on 6th Avenue in New York. I don't live in New York. I live on the West Coast, but I'm here this week to narrate the audiobook for my next book, which is called What the Fact. And it's a book that comes out in September. It's my 5th book, but my first time ever writing for young readers. So What the Fact is aimed at readers 12 ages and up, but lots of crossover appeal. So hoping adults read it too. And it's a nonfiction book that talks about fake news, and in a very entertaining, completely non-textbook-like way. What the Fact teaches media literacy, digital literacy, and critical thinking. So there's anecdotes and stories and scenarios and scripts in there for how to disagree with somebody who holds very strongly held beliefs about gun control or climate change. It talks about the 5 key methods that are used by science denialists, for example, to push falsehoods about climate change being a hoax, for example, and why it's important for young people, but all of us, to recognize those kinds of techniques that are used to dupe us and are really used to make misinformation and disinformation go viral. So I'm having fun narrating that because it's I've narrated my audiobooks before, but this is the first one for young people. And so we're getting to do like sound effects and things in it. So I've been making cat sounds, which is always a fun thing to do in the middle of the week. But, I got here in a very unlikely way, in that I went to medical school. I trained as an epidemiologist, did not plan on going into journalism or doing anything like this. But it does make sense if I explain it, in that I'm from the UK, obviously, grew up in a very tight-knit Muslim, Indian immigrant community in England. And so we saw ourselves misrepresented in the news all the time. It was just normal. You see Islamophobia and it continues. There are still these very recent horrific studies that show that when the New York Times reports on a defendant in a criminal trial, they are 700% more likely to mention the defendant's faith if they're Muslim compared to Christians. You kind of, you grow up knowing all about this BS and how you're misrepresented. So that was forefront of my mind. Again, didn't imagine a career in journalism, went to medical school, and came to the US 11 years ago to serve as an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service, which, if you've seen the movie Contagion with Kate Winslet, that was the job I had, where you're basically investigating different epidemics around the world. And it was a decade ago when I was doing that job that I was like, okay, I'm a public health doctor. This is what I'm training to do. But every epidemic I get sent to, it's clearly not just a virus that's spreading. There's anti-vax messaging, there's anti-mask, this stuff isn't new, it's been around forever. And I was really noticing that at the forefront of public health, that there was so much anti-science, misinformation and disinformation. And so even though I worked for CDC at the time, I was very frustrated that we weren't taking that information contagion seriously. And so after a few years, I left CDC to train as a journalist. Wasn't sure what I was going to do with that. I just felt like it was important to understand how to communicate clearly with different groups and to understand how information spreads, how to efficiently and accurately debunk falsehoods. Ended up working as a reporter at the Dallas Morning News, became a real advocate for local journalism. And, kind of long story short, here I am having kind of combined these careers. And it's funny because the part that I'm narrating of What the Fact today really dunks on local journalism and dunks on journalism in general because of, yes, support it, please subscribe to your local paper, but there's so much that journalism gets wrong. I'm sure you all have seen apologies in the Kansas Star in the last few years, apologies from Nat Geo and apologies from the LA Times, all of them saying, oops, we've erased Black people from our stories. We haven't covered stories from Black neighborhoods. We've misrepresented Black Kansans, or Nat Geo saying, oops, we shouldn't have said that Indigenous people have smaller brains and are less intelligent than white people. LA Times apologizing for its support of the internment of Japanese Americans. So there's a lot wrong with journalism, as much as I love it and appreciate the power of it. And What the Fact and kind of like my life's mission now feels like I want there to be better journalism because it can function as the immune system of a democracy. And I want our young people, but all of us, but especially our young people, to be able to read journalism critically, to say, nope, you can't call your journalism neutral because there's no such thing, or you say you're objective, but actually, let's have a conversation about what that means. So happy to take any questions and hear all your thoughts.
Yes, and I'll start with maybe 2 questions and then pause. But at any time, if you have a question, we want to make sure your questions are prioritized here. So I'll start with maybe one, and then we'll see. We can check in after each one. So the first question, building on what you just shared, we were just talking a little bit about the role, about one tactic for supporting students in understanding how to consume information is also helping them understand what journalism is and what they should be looking for. So building on what you just shared, could you tell us a little bit about what you see, what you would help us explain to students around what journalism should look like what kinds of things we should be looking for, what might they need to know about what journalism is and how that might be different from other information they're looking at. And then feel free to please share anything from the book or from your experience about what even in journalism we should be critically analyzing.
So one of the things that I really love and appreciate about Pulitzer Center is that it puts journalists in contact with young people. Like you all work for schools, right? Am I correct? Everyone's a teacher and you can have Pulitzer Center bring journalists into your newsroom to have these conversations with students. And the reason I bring that up first and foremost is because knowing what a journalist looks like and seeing a journalist and, hearing it from them, I think is really empowering in terms of helping students understand how journalism functions, how it's made. It's this person I may see it on the news or I might read it on a page, but this person and their biases and their processes and their education and their perspectives all went into, producing journalism. So to answer your question, because it's a really good one, but there's so much to say about that, I would condense it to say, how would I condense that? The way that I'm doing it in What the Fact is loads of examples, loads of anecdotes of what can go right and what can go wrong in journalism, what journalism can do to empower people and to hold those in power account, and then what can go wrong in terms of the misrepresentation, misinformation, the erasure. And I talk in What the Fact using examples about agenda setting, gatekeeping, framing, and explaining those concepts by using examples and saying, like, on any given day, there's only so much that can go in a newspaper or even on a website. You may think the internet is infinite, but there are decisions that are made about what will be front and center on a homepage of the New York Times or the Dallas Morning News or the Chicago Tribune. And I really get students to think about who gets to make that decision. And what do you think of the logo, or not the logo, like the slogan on the cover of the New York Times that says all the news that's fit to print? Can that be right? Like, what stories get left on the cutting room floor? And if only 7% of newsroom bosses in America are Black, even in Black majority regions, like, what does that mean about the news that we consume and who sets the agenda? And then I also talk about, thank you so much. I also talk about the fact that there's that massive disparity between who creates news and who consumes it. And journalism makes an impact. I think it's really important for students to understand what, and to just spell that out, like this has happened because of this reporting. This tragedy in Flint, Michigan continued for almost a year before the New York Times sent its reporters to Flint. Imagine one of the biggest environmental racism tragedies, a tragedy that's meant children have irreversible brain damage from lead, but they're mostly Black children and they're mostly poor children. The New York Times didn't cover that in any meaningful way, didn't send its reporters there for about 9 months. And then even when it did, let's look at that reporting. Whose voices are in that reporting? Is it Flint residents? Not really. Is it the politicians who kept saying the water is safe? Yeah. And I'm not making that up or saying it anecdotally. People have done analyses, and I talk about those in the book, where they've analyzed the New York Times' reporting on Flint, and who it gave more platform and power to and who it disempowered. So I think for students, it's so important to use concrete examples. And often in the classroom, you have to play around with that. So I know one time I did a trip to a Chicago school with Pulitzer Center, and I was going on and on about one particular example. And the students did look a bit disengaged. And then I switched it up to talking about like maternal mortality in the US and how, so depressing, but like how Black pregnant people are 3 or 4 times more likely to suffer terrible outcomes of pregnancy. And the students were like, wait, we didn't know that. Why isn't that covered? And like, who's covering that? And we need to talk about that. Why are we talking about other things? So I think it's also about engaging with examples that make sense to them and then kind of bringing journalism to life in that way. Hope that answers your question. There's so much to say on that.
Well, we are fortunate to have time to talk. So yes, that definitely was super helpful. Actually, I want to build on the examples. So one thing that we've seen helpful also in talking to students about misinformation and disinformation, and also erasure, which came up earlier as also disinformation, whose voice is being excluded, was to share some examples of what they look like and also but what the impact of those can be. Can you speak about, from your reporting career, like some of the stories you followed that we might be able to share with students of what misinformation, disinformation have looked like and what the impacts of that have been, maybe to get them engaged in thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's so important to think about the students in the classroom at that time, what time of year it is, what's a big news story at that particular moment, how old they are, where they live, and then really think about what examples make the most sense. But sometimes just to bring the conversations and the process to life, and it is all terrible and depressing, but I've told them stories just about, oh, the way the news gets decided, what is news, is a meeting that happens in the newsroom at 8 a.m. And it's mostly white bosses sitting around a long conference table and someone on a whiteboard saying, oh, all this stuff happened overnight. What's going in the paper? What do we not have resources to cover or no interest to cover, for example? And so as a lowly reporter at the Dallas Morning News, I wouldn't go to every 8 a.m. meeting, but sometimes if I really wanted to push for a story, I'd go. And I remember one time going and to one of these meetings, and there was a story being discovered that affected South Dallas. And there was a throwaway comment about, oh, we don't, I've forgotten the name of the area now. PG, we used to call it something Grove, I think. But anyway, it was like, oh, there's this thing happened in this part of South Dallas. And it was like such a culturally understood thing that we didn't really cover that particular neighborhood in South Dallas. So it was like, okay, I'll just call it Paradise Grove. It wasn't that, but like, Pleasant Grove. It was like, oh, it's okay to not cover that. And you're just like, wow, it can be that blatant. And I think it's important for students to realize then that, oh, representation really matters. And I remember another time I was one of the only non-white people at that smallish meeting. There's like 15 people there. And there was a Black reporter who was also like my age. We were opposite each other. And somebody was talking about a particular story in South Dallas, another part of South Dallas. And somebody was like, oh, we must include the Black voice in this. We must include the voice of Black residents in South Dallas. And somebody, and this is 2015, somebody actually said, send a reporter to a barbershop. And I remember me and this other reporter looking at each other like, oh, like that's where all Black people in South Dallas just reside 9 to 5, like like it's that egregious. And I think it's just helpful for them to know that sometimes it comes down to that. And then other times it's Dallas Morning News saying, we are going to cover South Dallas. It's so important we do a better job. Our first story in a series of South Dallas stories is going to be about stray dogs. And you talk to residents and they're like, we don't give a crap about that right now. What we care about is this housing issue. And it's like, again, gatekeeping, agenda setting, framing. So I think bringing it to life in that way, that again, really being mindful and working with Pulitzer Center, if you know, to think about who are our students, how do we really bring this alive and make it meaningful to them?
Shall I go with one more? Do others have a question yet? Yes. Do you mind coming over here, Heather? And
Thank you. So I'm gonna.
and she can see there.
I was gonna. Oh, you can see me here. I'm gonna.
Yeah, I
dig
can
down
see
though,
you.
so
Hey.
they can see me. They can see. Okay, cool. Hey, how are you? And thank you for coming.
Thanks for
So
asking.
listen,
I'm
you
good.
spoke about dialoguing with folk who may hold very, very strong and yet misinformed ideas when we talk about this idea of misinformation. And I was wondering, do you have tips for dialoguing, you know, something that I could share with students that would kind of give them some ideas about how to interface with folk who may be misinformed and yet loud and proud?
Yeah, thank you. And there's a whole section in What the Fact about why we end up polarized and how to have a conversation with somebody who holds very strongly held opposing beliefs to you. I think it's useful to highlight the thing that we often do that does not work, which is, let me throw some facts at you. Here are 6 reasons, and let's use an example. Here are 6 reasons why COVID vaccines are safe, and therefore you are wrong for thinking that COVID vaccines are unsafe. And one that makes an assumption that they haven't heard those 6 facts before, probably they have, at least heard half of them. Probably they've already not believed them. So then why just lob facts at someone? And I think by starting off with that point, you then start to talk about truth as a tribal construct and belief being part of our need to belong. And what I explain in What the Fact, and this really helped me make sense of it, is when you look at that conversation, vaccines are safe. No, they're not safe. Yes, they are. There's a clinical trial. There's 20 clinical trials. No, they're not. The government lies. When you look at that from an intellectualist, I think it's called, point of view, it doesn't make sense. Like, I have data. What are you talking about? But if you look at it from what social psychologists called an interactionist point of view, it does make sense, because that person who thinks, no, COVID vaccines are not safe, I can give you 6 legit, egregious examples of how the American government has conducted unethical medical experiments on vulnerable people. The way we end up like that is because I hold my beliefs that give me a sense of belonging and camaraderie and affirmation in my community, and yours give you the exact same in your community. So by me saying, I'm sorry, you're wrong, you're so wrong, there's all these data points that show vaccines are safe, I'm actually not just challenging your belief, I'm challenging your identity. I'm challenging things that are much more core to you. It's actually not just a conversation about vaccines, and it never was, and it never is. It feels like that on the surface. And I've really discovered that over the last decade or more, and I've really understood it more while writing What the Fact. And I think reminding people of that and reminding them of the data that shows that pouring facts onto a polarized conversation is like pouring kerosene onto a fire, helps you understand why these conversations go up in flames. Okay, so what does work? What can we do? I'll just throw this out there as a first rule is, should you be having that conversation, which sounds like a cop-out, because shouldn't we all be challenging someone who's misinformed? In What the Fact, I give an example of a Muslim girl wearing a hijab in line at the cinema, and the 2 guys in front of her saying like really Islamophobic things. That might not be the right space for her, where she's on her own, visibly Muslim, to challenge somebody who holds views that actually counter her right to exist peacefully. So I say that. The second thing I say, and then I also give the example of like somebody who holds power and privilege in society, like they might want to say something at that point. The other thing I say is that for those of us who are like, no, I need to have this conversation with my mom, my auntie, my spouse, is please know it is not a one and done conversation. It's a process. And the first conversation may not even address much of the vaccine debate. Because, and this, you could apply this to so many things, masks, climate change beliefs about healthcare access, but just sticking to vaccines, beliefs about vaccines that have something to do with what's inside the vial, but so much to do with what's outside of that. It's to do with your culture, ethnicity, faith traditions, languages spoken, power hierarchies within your community, outside of your community. All of that factors into it, and you can't address all of that in one conversation. What you can do in one conversation is, for example, open the door to there being dialogue and kind of establish that we can actually talk about something that's a little challenging to talk about. And so what I describe in What the Facts, and I go through literally, because it's written for 12 and up, right? So it's literally steps. Like, here is what you might do. Firstly, is it safe for you to have that conversation? Is you speaking up going to jeopardize you because you wear a hijab and you're the only Muslim there? Second, realize it's going to be more than one conversation. Okay, and now there's more steps as to how you might counter. And what I do in the books, I think you need examples, is I give a scenario of a teenager who's really worried about school shootings because another one just happened. And her mum's like, oh, another school shooting. It's mentally ill people that do this. It's not a gun control issue. It's a schizophrenia issue. And so it talks about how they're so at odds that they stop talking, but then how they start to have a series of conversations where they get to, how do we reach a place of understanding? Because this is horrible living together with such polarization in the house. So, you know, we could talk for hours about how to do that, but hopefully that gives some inroads. And again, I think just thinking about it from like intellectually, this is so frustrating. Like, how can you disagree? And then it's like, oh, you can disagree because your truth is a construct and your beliefs are based on more than evidence.
Thank you so much. Well, maybe I'll jump in with one, and then hopefully would love for it to hear additional questions. So often when we talk to students about the difference between breaking news and underreported stories, we'll start by asking what themes they're hearing about in the news. And COVID is always one that is mentioned. So, and I know that's something that you've reported on quite a bit. Can you speak a little bit about the misinformation and disinformation that you've reported on around COVID, which is something our students have all experienced and can relate to, and then also maybe talk through like where is it though that misinformation and disinformation coming from and what the impacts have been?
Yeah, and just to talk about some terms, misinformation we talk about as false information that's spread without any bad intent. Whereas disinformation is also false, but false information that's spread with deliberate intent to cause harm. So misinformation might be like your friend saying like, oh, I heard that if you gargle with loads of salt water, you can't get COVID. And it's not true, but they don't realize it's not true and they're hopefully not trying to hurt you. If that friend was being paid by the government to spread deliberately, don't gargle with salt water because you're going to end up getting COVID, but think you're safe from it. And they're trying to cause harm or chaos. That's a disinformation. And there's loads of examples. So in 2014, during Ebola, there was a hashtag that spread online that said Ebola in Atlanta. And this group from Russia that created a really good copy of the CNN homepage that made it look like there was an Ebola outbreak in Atlanta. And that's disinformation because you could get people like flooding the ER and suddenly, I think I've got Ebola. You can get chaos. You can, use up your emergency services in the wrong way. So I think it's good to use examples like that. I always like to bring up with young people, like in the context of COVID, there's the blatant misinformation and disinformation. Let's go through some examples. The president at the time talked about injecting bleach. There was an uptick in the number of calls to poison control centers around that same time. So we can talk about the link between things that are spread and harm that's done to people. There's more examples in What the Fact of people who didn't wear masks because they saw on Facebook that it was like COVID is just mild, for example, and one of them, they died and they regretted it. So I talk about that stuff, like very obvious inject bleach. Okay, that's wrong, right? And you can make them differentiate between misinformation and disinformation. But again, I think it's so important to talk about gatekeeping and agenda setting and framing in the context of COVID too. So you just get them to think about, like, what stories haven't you seen? Have you seen much reporting about COVID in prisons, in youth detention facilities? What stories have you seen a lot of? And I know early in COVID, I was doing some teaching for the Pulitzer Center, and Hannah and I, we used an example of a New York Times article about COVID, but it was about this like Australian couple who got stranded in the Maldives because COVID affected travel and there was a lockdown. And this whole New York Times article centers the horror, okay, and probably was very inconvenient, of this couple who are like, oh, we can't get home, we're stuck on an eternal honeymoon, doesn't mention all of the, you know, quite poor, lower class people who are looking after them, who also can't leave and get back to their families. So again, that kind of perspective in the story and getting students to think critically. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it makes us ask more questions, like reading between the lines. Who's in this story? Who isn't? Who decided this was a story? Who decided not to include the voices of the housekeeping staff who are probably really badly affected by lockdown?
Do others have a question? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Catherine Irving. I teach high school. So I just wanted to build on your previous response about having these dialogues, how to go about it. And so I was just thinking, in the classroom, how do you have these dialogues without giving too much credence to completely wrong or offensive views?
Yeah, that's really, really hard in general. And there is a body of literature that says, like, oh, does debunking a myth actually help it spread? Because you're giving it more oxygen and you're giving it a platform. And there is the body of literature that says that. But then I argue towards the body of literature that says that, well, if you do it using these techniques, it can be efficient and effective. And so I think it's really important to get to not do the thinking for the students, because I think young people are really good at critical thinking when they're given the space to sit in the gray area and maybe talk about a piece of misinformation or disinformation that has the potential for harm, and get them to think about who it hurts, whose agenda does it further, who does this piece of information empower if it goes viral, what consequences might occur if that information carries on. And to make that point, you might try and engineer the conversation so you're picking something that has that kind of potential, but isn't on the terrible, terrible, terrible end of the spectrum. On the other hand, I think we have to be cognizant that young people are exposed to some really extreme stuff. And some of what I talk about on What the Fact is research that shows you can look on YouTube for healthy eating video and not long after end up on neo-Nazi cooking videos. And I kind of literally trace the steps as to how an algorithm might take you from, I want to know how to make a tasty salad, to a video that is two Aryan nation boys saying Hitler was a vegetarian, we should all be vegetarian, being vegetarian is linked to a pure bloodline and whiteness. And I say that because they're exposed to this because of autoplay, because of algorithms. There's research I cite about how you can be looking for a fitness video on TikTok, and within 24 hours, not you being on it, but like within 24 hours, you're shown pro-anorexia content, even though TikTok says it's banned these particular hashtags. So I think, we shouldn't shy. I think I'm really glad you raised that, because even my instinct is like, oh, bring up something that's not too harmful to maybe the people in the room, but actually let's be real about what they're exposed to. And one of the points that I raise in the book is that, well, okay, Nazis were around before social media. It's not like social media is necessarily like the reason for Nazism, but what social media does it centers usually marginalized ideas and it mainstreams them. So where you and I in a classroom might have a conversation about, oh my gosh, I heard this really absurd thing on the internet, or I read something, I heard this thing, and it said like, pure blood is linked to pure soil. And it's like, oh my gosh, they're arguing that like whiteness is purity. Okay, so we're having this conversation. We're repeating actually this really harmful idea, but it's couched in all this language about, oh my gosh, can you believe it? This is wild and it's so scary. You don't get that context when you're seeing it online. In fact, what you'll see is the video that says Hitler was a vegetarian, which is actually untrue because he actually liked turtle soup and sausages. But again, misinformation, right? You'll see that content that says vegetarianism, whiteness, Aryanism, purity, superior supremacy, but you won't hear that context that we would have had. And you'll just see it upvoted or liked a lot or viewed a lot and commented on a lot. All these things that further center and affirm the message. So you see something wild and hateful and harmful, fully endorsed by perhaps millions of people.
Other questions? Yes, thank you. Yay, appreciate you all.
Hi, Dr. Yasmin. Thank you for making your time. I'm Adelaida Kim, and I teach fourth graders in Chicago. So 50% of my students are English learners, meaning they come from culturally diverse backgrounds and heritage, and 50% are also culturally diverse, but they are Black American students. It was really interesting for me to see that when a vaccine was available for younger children, majority of my immigrant families, children decided to get vaccinated versus my African-American students, majority of them decided not to get the vaccine. And I understand the historical trauma that our Black students have received or families have received. So as a teacher, it was really hard for me to balance those ideologies that come from families. So what do you recommend as a teacher to respect both of the sides, understanding the historical trauma that are still really visible?
Yeah, and I would say, you talk about historic trauma, but medical racism is very much a modern day phenomenon. It's happening all the time. How do we address that in a way that kind of includes the experiences of all students? I think by talking about the history and the modern day manifestations of that history, I think it's really helpful to go through examples. And you can pick an example that's like adjacent to what's happening sometimes, but a little bit removed. So one of the examples I use is something that happened, I think, in 2015, when there was like a really bad tuberculosis outbreak in Alabama. And I was a reporter at the time, but lots of friends and colleagues still at CDC. And so, of course, CDC goes to Alabama and it's like, oh, wow, worst TB outbreak in America for like hundreds of years, highest TB rate. It's like really, really bad. And even like my public health friends are like pulling out their hair. Oh, we're offering cash incentives to people in this town to come get TB tested. We're offering cash incentives to get an x-ray. We're going to pay if you take the prophylactic medicine. Why is no one coming? And it's like, it's a 2-hour drive from Tuskegee. Like, do you think there might be some impact? And so, okay, that's not COVID and it's not about vaccines, but I think that sometimes something that's slightly adjacent, and there's so many examples like that, that can be helpful. Another example that I give in the book is about one of the worst measles outbreaks in Minnesota in recent history. It was a terrible measles outbreak, and it largely affected Somali Americans in the Minneapolis area. Kids ended up in ICU. Measles is a really serious infection. It's not like mild, like people say, like just a rash. It can cause deafness and seizures and neurological problems, and rarely it can even cause death. And what had happened is, you talk about the perhaps non-American born or immigrant kids to the US having more likely to be vaccinated against COVID. And that was the situation in Minneapolis, that non-American born kids had much higher rates of MMR vaccination compared to American born kids. And the anti-vaccine groups years ago preyed on that and had these closed door town halls in Minnesota targeted at Somali American families, saying, oh, you shouldn't be doing the MMR, like it causes all these problems. They had armed guards at the doors. And of course, over a decade that worked, and the MMR vaccination coverage rate halved, went from 90 something percent to 40 something percent. And of course, then there was a measles outbreak. And so I think sometimes getting the kids to think about something that's happened before and then have those conversations. Well, why was the vaccination rate so high amongst immigrant communities? How did it fall so low? Perhaps that's a useful way of having the conversation that can take, and then COVID will come up, but perhaps it's not fully centered initially in that conversation. And I think another important thing to just remember and remind ourselves of is like, no community is a monolith. You know, not all Black Americans hold the same beliefs about vaccinations in the same way that not all Muslims, you know, feel the same about hijab or about vaccines. And so there's so much variety and variability and diversity within our community. So just to be mindful for all of us all the time, to not frame it as, hey, did you know Black people in America don't like vaccines because of, well, actually, that's not overwhelming, you know, that might not be broadly true. There's so much disparity. I think that's helpful to have as a conversation too.
Thank you so much. We can probably do 2 more questions and then we'll break for lunch. Does anyone have a question they would like to ask? Yes, thank you. There you go.
Hello, I'm Isaac. I'm a MA student here. Something I've noticed with a lot of people that sort of buy in to a lot of this misinformation is that it's very, very rarely they're just anti-vax, or they're, you know, just QAnon, or they're just a flat earther. It seems to always be a package deal in a way. And I think a good example, if anyone's familiar, there's an independent journalist called Channel 5, and he goes to a lot of these conventions where these people congregate, and it'll be 10 minutes before an anti-Semite comes out everywhere, whether it's crypto, whether it's any of these sort of like scammy atmospheres. So it seems to be that a lot of people have sort of attached their identity to being a type of unhealthy skeptic. And, you know, and you also have these sort of grifting personalities like Joe Rogan, who that is what their whole career is built on, is finding these fringe people to congregate this audience. So there seems to be, at least, I don't know what to call it, but a very large amount of people that have built their entire identity around being this kind of skeptic. So I guess my question is like, how does that factor into all this? Like, I have no idea how to deal with it, so I don't. So
yeah, it's like what I was saying earlier. An anti-vax belief is a little bit to do with what's in the vaccine vial, but it's about a lot more to do with what's outside the vial. And we often neglect that in a conversation about vaccines. Like I said earlier, it's never just about vaccines. It's never just about climate change. And that's why challenging someone's belief can blow up and you're like, wait, what? I was just telling you about the trials. Actually, what it felt like to them was an attack on their identity, an attack against their community. Truth is tribal and belief is about belonging. So remembering that all the time helps you understand, like, why are the anti-vaxxers also climate change denialists or also QAnon? Well, no, it completely makes sense if you stop thinking about it from an intellectualist point of view, thinking about it from an interventionist point of view, and remembering truth is a construct. We've all created our own truths based on different evidences, and what we believe is a lot to do with who we are surrounded by and which community we're going to belong to. And so many of our conversations fail, I think, because we don't address that. And I think understanding that it's never just about one of these things actually helps to have more effective, efficient conversations where, again, it's really not a one, how can this be a one and done conversation? And when I teach doctors and nurses about how to have conversations with people who, and I don't use anti-vax very much as a term because most people are not anti-vax. They might have some level of vaccine hesitancy. They sit somewhere on a spectrum of, you know, confidence about vaccines, and they might be really confident about MMR vaccines and have their kids fully gone through the childhood schedule, but not COVID vaccines. So we have to be really careful about understanding where people are coming from, actually what their views are, and not lumping our own assumptions onto them because of particular beliefs they hold. But there's a lot to be said about polarization, how we've ended up in this situation, whose agenda that serves, and who might have engineered and stoked lots of polarization in many countries. And I think getting young people to think about can be empowering to them, because otherwise I think we leave them and us with a lot of like, oh, this is all so bad. It's all terrible. There's so much fake news, as opposed to empowering them with, actually, let's break it down. Let's not even use that term fake news, because that's used as a word grenade to disempower journalists. Let's call it misinformation and disinformation. Let's talk about malinformation. Let's talk about the 7 subtypes of mis and disinformation, which I go through in the book. And now you can start describing what you're seeing. Like, oh, is this satire? Is it parody? Is it false context? Is it manipulated content? And that really starts to empower them, because they can diagnose what they're seeing, and they can start thinking about the intention and thinking about why something has gone viral.
Thank you so much. And maybe just to close out on that note of empowerment, before we transition and we'll process a little of the conversation, have lunch. Anything else you want to share with us about how we can empower students in this media landscape, or any like closing words you'd like to share with the educators?
Thank you, first of all, for doing what you're doing. Like, it's challenging, it's tricky. Hopefully it feels very rewarding in some ways too. And I think, you use the word empowering, and I think that's really important, because otherwise it does feel like doom and gloom, and this is an intractable problem, and you can't trust anything, and journalism is terrible. And it's like, actually, let's look at the bright spots. Let's look at where journalism has toppled corrupt governments and ousted scandalous CEOs. Let's talk about the red flags for spotting false information. Look at you. Now you have these tools where you can protect yourself, and you can be the person with whom a false tweet ends because you refuse to forward it because you've spotted that it's false. So I think empowerment is really important, and it's how we'll end up, in the future without other insurrections happening, because we've had a generation of young people have these conversations. I am disappointed there aren't more resources out there for you, but that's why we've created What the Fact. And Pulitzer Center is creating a teaching guide to go with it. So hopefully that brings to life many of the stories and the anecdotes and examples from inside the book to give you classroom activities that get the students thinking about stuff like this. There are activities that are going to make them the editor of a newspaper, where they have to think, use news judgment, think about framing, agenda setting, gatekeeping, think about the consequences of their decisions. But I thank you for doing your work, and I really hope What the Fact and the teaching guide are useful to you.
Can we share our thanks and our well wishes to Dr. Yasmin?
Thanks.
And good luck with the rest of the recording today. And we'll make sure everyone has a link to learn more about What the Fact. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.